Okay, welcome to Gospel Backgrounds number 20. This is the other side, and this is going to be looking at mostly Mark chapter 5, but we'll start at Mark 4, verse 35, and then we'll have some parallel passages in Matthew and Luke. Again, as usual, I'm just going to read one of the Gospel books, so we'll read from Mark in this case, but I do encourage you to periodically pause and compare the Matthew and Luke passages. Sometimes there's some interesting differences that each of the gospel writers pick up. Again, we always want to start with Acts 17:11, and we are reminded that the Bereans received the word with all eagerness, but they examined scriptures daily to see if these things were so. So a couple of the commentaries I use present some very different viewpoints from our traditional, usually Protestant Christian commentaries. And it's not to say that one's right and the other's wrong, but I think it's healthy to look at all sides and then always go back to Scripture to draw our own conclusions. So our topics will look at what the other side means. That has a cultural and even a spiritual reference as well as a geographic reference, even though it's a very small area that we're talking about. There were some very distinct cultures around different parts of the Sea of Galilee. Then along the way, there is a storm that has experienced fishermen who knew those waters, scared for their lives. And then we'll look at that. And then on the other side, we have the demoniac at Gadara, and then the disciples have had enough of Gentile lands, and then they'll sail back to the Capernaum area, where we have the 12-year-old daughter who is raised from the dead, and then also the woman with the 12-year discharge who is healed. Mark 4, verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. So here is our map, and we're going to start at Capernaum, and then we're going to sail across to the other side. As we talked about previously, the phrase crossover had cultural as well as geographic significance. So Jesus spent most of his ministry in this area here on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. So from here at Magdala all the way over to Bethsaida, those would have been the religious observant Jews. So when he crosses over to the other side, the western side here would be all of the Gentile lands. Jesus makes very few recorded visits to this area, but what we're going to see today is one of them. And these areas actually had very little to do with each other. They may as well have been on the other side of the world. And what's even kind of more fascinating is that this western side to the southwestern shore would have been what we might call the Hellenistic Jews. And so what's a Hellenistic Jew? Well, we might call these the compromisers. They wanted the best that secular Greek and Roman society had to offer while still going to church on Sunday. I mean, going to synagogue on Saturday. I mean, you get my point, right? We have this today. There's nothing new under the sun. I think most of our church today is just as compromised as the Hellenistic Jews in Jesus' day were. So there's maybe a parallel that Jesus never visited here with in the church of Laodicea. That's our picture of a compromised church. That is the church where Jesus is standing outside the door knocking to be let in. So let us avoid the trappings of pleasure and trappings of the world while kind of being Christians in name only, and let's strive to be more devout followers of Jesus, which is what our series is all about. This is a pan photograph that shows the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee from around Capernaum, and we're looking across to the other side. So you can see it's not that far, right? The lake is not that big. However, this is the area of the Golan Heights. They're very steep, and kind of creates a bowl shape of the lake. And we'll talk about that when we start talking about the storms that can arise even to this day on the Sea of Galilee. This is the boat that was discovered in the mud in 1986 and gives us a good idea of what a first century fishing boat would have looked like. So Jesus is, they're trying to get away from the crowds. Looks like Jesus is seeking some rest and needing to recharge. And obviously he's extremely fatigued after days and days of teaching, probably back to back. And yet the crowds were just not leaving him alone, so they almost had to sneak away and get out on the boat. We might imagine that they might have had to do some sort of dodge, right? Where the disciples are going to act like they're going to go out for a night of fishing so that the crowd goes away, and then they sneak Jesus out to one of the boats to kind of get away from everything. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. But he, Jesus, was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? So this is the proverbial dark and stormy night that many horror stories begin with. So although this lake is very small, the surrounding geography can contribute to some monster storms. And you can see these waves are huge. You know, if you were surfing and didn't mind crashing into rocks, these might be good surfing waves. Who knows? So what happens is winds come from the west, the Mediterranean Sea, and this is the Arbel Pass here. The winds come and they're funneled through this pass, and then they're kind of dumped into the Sea of Galilee, where they hit the far walls on the eastern side, and then they just form this funnel-like effect. And then there's actually a science term called the Venturi effect, where if you put winds through and then you choke them, so like think of pouring liquid out of a bottle that has a bottleneck. This is the classic bottleneck. The resulting winds are actually 50% faster than they were originally. So it just kind of creates this whip effect, and so the wind immediately hit the walls of the cliffs on the other side, and they had nowhere to go, and so you just get these storms that, even though the lake is small, it is just subject to these crazy storms. So the thing that strikes me is that these were experienced fishermen who knew these waters, right? So they were professionals, and yet there was something very unique about this storm that has them absolutely terrified. Lancaster sees a direct allusion to Jonah, and we can read this in Jonah 1, 4 through 6. If you want to pause it and read it, I'm not going to go ahead and read it now, but you can see just some parallels. So we have, one, a potentially deadly storm that has experienced fishermen fearing for their lives. Two, the principal character is sleeping, just as Jonah was asleep and Jesus was asleep. Three, the sailors awaken the sleeper and then rebuke him, saying, Don't you care? And aren't you going to do anything about this? And then, of course, 4, the sleeper has the answer. So Jonah says, It's my fault, and then Jesus calms the storm. The storms are then miraculously calmed, and the calming actually terrifies the sailors as much as the storm itself did. And of course, we have both Jesus and Jonah spending 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish in Jonah's case, and then the belly of the earth in Jesus' case. So just some interesting parallels between this story and Jonah. So here we can see the sea is nice and calm. Hush, be still, he says, and this is, it's the same language he uses to rebuke an evil spirit, which is interesting. It leads some to suspect that this was no ordinary storm. It gives rise to the idiom that we use today, O ye of little faith. So we know the disciples had some faith, but it's only in times of testing that we find out how strong and how deep our faith is. It's interesting, we're getting ready to put our house on the market, and we had these massive rainstorms, and then so we had leaks that kind of the worst timing ever, but we kind of found out what our house is made of, and what areas we needed to shore up in preparation to sell it. So we had to do some roof work, and had to strengthen a little bit, and I think spiritually there's probably an application in there. So Jesus just got finished saying that the kingdom would grow like wheat until the great harvest. So as Schlegel states, there's no way Jesus was going to end up as an accident statistic at the bottom of the sea a few hours later. So Jesus had everything under control. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and then Matthew notes Gadarenes. We'll talk about that on the next slide. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him any more, not even with a chain. So he had some superhuman strength. He had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with the stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. So again, someone else falling at Jesus' feet. There's kind of a theme happening here. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." And then interesting that Matthew records, "Have you come here to torment us before the appointed time?" So possibly my son had an experience where I no longer see any contradiction here. He met someone at who he was pretty sure was demon possessed, and we don't see a lot of this, and I of course wish he hadn't, but for the good side is it opened his eyes to the spiritual world. This person said to Aiden, "You make us uncomfortable," and Aiden's my son. And then Aiden said, "What did you say?" And then he said, "You make me uncomfortable." So this very creepy person, used the us and me in the same sentence. Kind of interesting. So there's definitely something about names that's going on in this passage. Jesus demands to know the demon's name, and apparently they know that they confess, if you will, the name of Jesus. They label him as the Son of the Most High God, and they're trying to adjure you by God, do not torment me, as if trying to exert some influence over him. So it's interesting. All this is very spooky. And then Matthew adds, "Have you come to torment us? Not just torment us, but torment us before the appointed time." So again, is there an end destiny for these demons? And they possibly felt that Jesus' early arrival was somehow unfair, and they're trying to, get him to undo this. So James says the demons believe and tremble, but so it's one thing to believe that Jesus is the Son of the Most High God, but if you're not following him, then we're no that person is no better than a demon, because a demon is definitely not saved. They are damned in every sense. So this is a picture that was taken from Gadara, and it shows a portion of the district controlled by the city, and you can get a sense for the steep cliffs here, which will become significant when we get to the pig passage that we'll read later. There is a well-known textual variant here. This is Bolin writing between Gerasenes, Gadarenes, and Gergesenes. So depending on what translation you have and then which book you're reading, they may use any one of these terms. Bolin writes, the best manuscript evidence supports the reading Gerasenes, as in Luke chapter 8. Gadara was a city that was in the district of Gerasa. So Gerasa was the leading city of the Decapolis. So Matthew may have been using the term Gadarene, which would have been more familiar to his audience, whereas Mark and Luke use the more general Gerasene. So it's general region. So it's like me when I meet people, I tell them I'm from Los Angeles. Since very few people outside of Southern California have ever heard of the town where I actually grew up, which is Hermosa Beach. But by saying Los Angeles, it doesn't mean I ever lived in downtown LA. And then if someone asks me, well, where in Los Angeles, then I know that they're local, and then I can be more specific. So it could be that kind of thing that's going on here with this story. This is a picture of one of the tombs that is in this region, so we can get a sense that they're kind of hewn out of the rock, and then this man would have been living, as Lancaster says, an unclean man living in an unclean tomb, and he has unclean spirits. For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged them earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned into the sea. So it's easy to miss, but note that Mark and Luke report that Jesus was encountering some resistance. So he says he was saying to him, verse 8, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit," and then they say, "Have you come to appoint us?" So they're pushing back a little bit, if we can say. So this whole passage is just really spooky. In Mark's account, they beg him not to send him out of the region. So from this we get that demons are territorial. I, for one, I'm not so quick to dismiss tales of haunted houses. it's particularly those that have a history of maybe some unsavory activities. So Ouija boards and things like that, where strange things just happen. I encourage all of us to walk our property periodically and pray over every room in your house. And so it's great to do that when you're building your house and when you first move in. But if you've got kids with internet access, we have no idea what is being allowed in or what is forcing their way into our property. And we just need to keep prayer and keep the Spirit covering where we live. So this leads to perhaps my very favorite Bible joke of all time. What we have here is the first case of deviled ham. If you like that joke, you can credit Chuck Missler. If you don't like that joke, you can blame Chuck Missler. Don't blame me. Back in verse 9, that Keener notes that this is the only recorded example of Jesus seeking a name. So he wants to know who he's dealing with. And then for whatever reason, the demons think that they're going to get a fair exchange by being sent out of the man and into the pigs. So apparently that sounded better than being cast into the abyss. So strange stuff going on here. From this, we get that the demons apparently seek embodiment, right? And then somewhat surprisingly, Jesus agrees to their demand. So this whole thing is just very strange. In Matthew's account, his Jewish audience would have kind of felt that this was a fitting end. Unclean pigs would be rightful hosts for unclean spirits. It's interesting, Keener notes that Jewish tradition often taught that demons could die. So this may be in a bit of contrast to our perception that demons and their angelic counterparts are eternal. We know they were created and had a beginning, so Jewish tradition taught that demons had an end. So a lot of people wonder why they would just be cast into the herd of pigs only to have the pigs drowned, and then they're disembodied again. But in fact, they may actually have perished here. This photograph shows the region of the Gadarenes, and this is the likely area where the pigs, and I can only imagine them squealing and shrieking in terror, sort of like at an Arkansas football game. Just kidding. They charged down the hill and they ran into the lake and they were drowned. So there's a harbor here. Remnants have been discovered, and so this is a potential place. But really, as we said earlier, anywhere along this ridge would be a likely candidate. You can easily imagine pigs grazing on the steep slope and then being cast in and rushing into the sea. So not only were pigs unclean and they kind of represented Gentiles. So again, this is Gentile area. People ask, why are there pigs here in Israel? Remember, this is the Decapolis, which are the Gentile lands. The 10th Roman legion, I think we talked about a few lessons ago, had the standard of a wild boar. So there's maybe some symbolism here. By casting out legion, they were hoping that Jesus would also cast off the yoke of the Roman legions as well. So could be that double symbolism going on. He didn't do this during his first coming, which many wanted him to do, but we know that the so-called Antichrist appears to be a leader of a revived Roman Empire. And so in the second coming, we know that Jesus will quite literally throw off the yoke of the Romans and their legions during his second coming. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there, clothed in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they begged Jesus to depart from their region. That's interesting. This is the picture of the Cardo, which in a Roman city is like the main street. It's where all the commerce would have occurred and the shops and all that, and it would have been where the people gathered. So it's interesting that in John 4, the woman runs into town and says, come see a man who knows everything, and then the people rush out and they actually beg him to stay. But here, once news reaches the village, the men rush out and they beg him to leave. Why didn't they bring out their sick and their infirm, right? Follow the money, right? Apparently Jesus is bad for business. The herd of pigs was property that were lost, and so they want him to leave. Also, there's the thought that many Gentiles did fear magicians and sorcerers, and so they kind of wanted nothing to do with that. Of course, Lancaster, who is a Messianic Jew, he sees a parallel with these unclean pigs, with the unclean things that we hold on to, right? We're unwilling to let Jesus interfere with idols and things like that. So maybe take a look at your Netflix and browsing history, and think of things that are unclean that we maybe need to let go of. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. So he wanted to be his disciple. Jesus did not permit him, but he said, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. So it's interesting to note that Jesus forbids a Gentile to become one of his disciples. Um, and it's also interesting that Jesus permits the Gentile to tell everyone. We'll look at some reasons for that on an upcoming slide, but ultimately the risk of unwanted attention that Jesus was concerned about is not as great in the Gentile lands as it was in places like Capernaum. So it may make a good commentary quip to say that Jesus is closing the door to the Jews while opening the door to the Gentiles, and a lot of people get that from he tells all the Jewish people to stay quiet and he tells the Gentiles to tell everyone. But I would say that sentiment is only half true. What is true is the door of invitation was definitely open to the Gentiles, but um, basically Jews were already inside and seated at the table, so it's not like they're being rejected at all. So why this contrast? And there's just some notes that I picked up in some various commentaries. Jewish people had already exceeded his capacity, and we learned that from Mark 1, verse 45. He could no longer publicly enter a city because of the crowds. In contrast, Gentiles were not likely to cross into Jewish territory to seek out a Jewish healer. So the concern of the crowd just wasn't that much. His Jewish followers were already misunderstanding his role as Messiah. Again, as we've talked about, even John the Baptist expected a conquering Messiah who, a political savior kind of thing. Whereas Gentiles had none of these messianic frames of reference. They weren't zealots. They weren't likely to begin to cause a revolt by following him. Without the full story, Gentiles would have assumed Jesus was just another magician, and they didn't particularly care for magicians. They wanted to, they kind of wanted to distance themselves. But Jesus tells the man to go tell what the Lord had done. So he wants a true story of what happened. And pragmatically, in Jewish territory, Jesus was specifically trying to stay under Herod Antipas's radar, but Herod had no jurisdiction in the Decapolis Gentile areas. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, fell at his feet. So again, we have this theme of falling at Jesus' feet. He implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And Jesus went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. So this is a picture of the Capernaum synagogue before the modern excavation and then restoration of the synagogue. It's kind of interesting to see. This is probably in the early 1900s. So I'm really enjoying how this study is challenging things that I've heard for my entire Christian life. So the mainstream interpretation of what's happening here is that Jesus is always at odds with the religious establishment. That's simply fake news, right? Here the religious establishment, at least at Capernaum, is on good terms with him. They intercede on behalf of the centurion, and now Jairus himself is directly going on behalf of his daughter. So let's not automatically assume that every Jewish leader rejected Jesus. We know that some did, but not all did. In fact, I have a suspicion that we'll all get a chance to meet Jairus one day, because I believe, especially, he probably believed in Jesus before this, but certainly after raising his daughter, Jairus would have had no reason not to become a believer in Jesus as a Messiah. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who suffered much under many physicians. She had heard all the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, said, "Who touched me?" So this is a picture of some implements. I kind of appreciate the interpretation here that a woman who had endured many things from many physicians. Um, Revelation talks about sorcery, and the Greek word used for sorcery is pharmakia, which is where we get our word pharmacy from. And it's amazing even today how patients, they may be on 6 or more different medications, 2 of which are for the original problem, and the other 4 are to counter the side effects of the first 2. So we are a heavily medicated society, and that just doesn't sound like healing to me. I know medicines have their place, but apparently maybe some things were not much different in Jesus' day, in which kind of the superstitious remedies were concocted, and we really kind of don't know what we're messing with by changing our chemistry around, and I'll kind of leave it at that. Many traditional commentators assume the woman was Gentile because the law, according to that reckoning, the law forbids a Jewish woman with a flow of blood from being in the assembly. And then thus their interpretation is we have Jesus on his way to heal a daughter of Israel, but he's interrupted by a Gentile and diverts his attention. This is then said to be a picture of Jesus, who initially came for Israel, but because they rejected their Messiah, the Gentile church replaces Israel. This premise is entirely faulty. I hope we're all beginning to learn to apply Acts 17:11, which is why I lead off with that every lesson. And we need to kind of do our homework and do our diligence. And so we've talked about the fact that this is Capernaum, this is a Jewish area. It's much more likely that the crowd that followed Jesus would have been Jewish. And then number 2, being in a large crowd might have been poor etiquette. The woman was not technically forbidden from being in that crowd, according to Jewish law. She was ritually unclean, and we can read about this in Leviticus 15, but she did not have the same status as a leper. She did not have to quarantine herself from all of society. Where she couldn't go was in the temple, and the temple is 70 miles away in Jerusalem. She's not prohibited from being in any other place. So again, not too unlike the prostitute that fell at Jesus' feet. This woman has definitely been relegated to the margins of society, but she knew where to go and what to do, even if it meant breaking a few customs. So again, just challenge this notion that Jesus came to bring a new religion. He came to heal both Jews and Gentiles, as we see in this passage. It's interesting today that the Orthodox do not touch members of the opposite gender, other than their wives and daughters, of course. So partly this is out of respect, but partly it's a woman in her menstrual cycle does render someone else unclean if they were to touch. So touching Jesus did render him unclean, and so it kind of would have been frowned upon, but again, it wasn't forbidden. I'm reminded of a story in 2013. We went to Israel and we did some service work at a preschool, and all the teachers were there were all Orthodox women. And as one of these teachers was thanking us, one of the guys in our group went to shake her hand, because before COVID, that's what we did, right? We expressed our gratitude and appreciation by a handshake. She immediately stepped back and folded her hands, which caused a bit of tension and awkwardness. But she apologized and just says, it's a cultural thing. We don't touch the opposite sex. So probably overall not a bad idea. But it's just interesting the different cultures. Coming in from the crowd, she touched his garment. And there's a lot going on here that we need some cultural background to understand. So Matthew 9 and Luke 8 include the detail that this woman touched only the fringe of Jesus' garment. This would have been, in Greek, it's the word kraspedon, and admittedly that sounds like some kind of weird Star Trek species, but actually in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it is the word used to translate the Hebrew word tzitzit. And it comes to us as tassels or fringes. So where does this come from? In Numbers 15, the Israelites were instructed to make tassels or tzitzit on the corners of their garments, and this was a reminder for them to obey God's commandments. Numbers also required a single cord of blue, which you can see in the picture on the screen of a modern prayer shawl. Now, what was worn in Jesus' day would have been basically 4 pieces of cloth stitched together, and then the Numbers passage indicates the tassels were to be sewn on the corners. They did not use ritual garments like the one you see, but although they're close and they try to get there. The thing about the blue dye is it was very expensive, and it was a reminder that following God is to be a special undertaking and not just a routine task that you do on a list of things to do. Is okay, let me check off my prayer time. I know a lot of us do that, and that's good, because that may be the only way some of us have prayer time. But really, like Chuck Missler used to say, God wants to be number one on a list of one, not number one on a list of 10, right? He wants to be first and foremost everything, and then all that we do else flows out of him. So that's kind of what the blue dye recommends. We may remember this, the kraspedon or the tzitzit or the fringes in Matthew 23, and this is where Jesus criticizes certain Pharisees for having their kraspedon so long that they appeared pious and more ostentatious. Note that he doesn't criticize the Pharisees for wearing the fringes. In Jesus' day, all observant Jews would have worn the tzitzit. Jesus was an observant Jew, so by the context and by the language, it is unquestionably the tzitzit that the woman grabbed a hold of. So the next question is, okay, why? What's so special about the tzitzit? Basically, it was believed in those days that there was power in the tzitzit of a righteous one. There's also an interesting word play for the word corner. So the Numbers 15 passages says you affix them to the corner of your garment. The word in Hebrew for corner happens to be the same as the word for wing, such as the wings of a bird or the wings of an airplane. And there's an interesting passage in Malachi 4 that says the sun, and now that's S-U-N, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings, or we can now say healing in its corners, or by really extension, healing in its tzitzit. And here, even though it's spelled S-U-N, it is a euphemism for the Messiah, and so perhaps the woman with the issue of blood, knew this verse and felt certain she would find healing in the tzitzit of her Messiah. And although that sounds weird, Jesus agrees. Jesus rewards her. We see this also in Mark 6, wherever he came in villages, cities, or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garments. And as many as touched it were made well. So we see this kind of later on in the Gospel of Mark as well. Knowing this unlocks an interesting and often misinterpreted passage in Ruth. So knowing this about the corner. So this in Ruth chapter 3 is this threshing floor scene. And it's commonly interpreted that Ruth is basically propositioning Boaz sexually, like she wants to hop in the sack with him. But actually, if you know anything about the morality and the righteousness of Ruth and Boaz, this just can't be accurate. It just doesn't fit the context. So, but as Chuck Missler says, it's not sexual. It's far worse than that. As a Gentile, Ruth is asking him to take her under Boaz's wing of protection. So, who are you? I am Ruth. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. So again, it's this protection, and it's the corner. Basically, cover me with your tzitzit, or with your, in Greek, kraspedon. So now you know what's happening on the threshing floor scene. By the way, Ruth, of course, is a picture of us as Gentiles asking to come under our Redeemer's authority, power, and protection, just as this woman did. The woman in Mark 5 knew this, and the power of being under his cover and under his wings. Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and says, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. So Jesus is insistent. He's searching here. The woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and again fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So it's interesting. We mentioned earlier that by her having the issue of blood and then touching Jesus, that made Jesus unclean as well. So if Jesus had said nothing, no one would have known that he was ritually unclean. But so he kind of calls attention to both the woman and his uncleanness. Keener notes a contrast that this story followed the storm and the disciples' lack of faith, and he contrasts that with the faith of this woman. So remember, in that society, women were considered emotionally weaker, and yet this woman is stronger and has more faith than even our learned disciples. There's some debate as to whether Jesus actually knew the woman or he truly didn't know and didn't know who touched him. So to me, that's not really material. But either way, we can tell that this question, the fact that he asked it, puzzled the disciples. It's kind of like, why are you pausing? We've got to get to this, our synagogue's daughter and heal, and yet you're stopping for this kind of trivial thing. So anyway, to me, my suspicion is that Jesus is allowing the woman to come forward so that she can publicly acknowledge this miracle. And I think a lot of commentaries will pick up on this little nuance. So meanwhile, this interruption by this woman with the issue of blood, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" So in other words, Jesus, this guy is too late. He waited too long. So let it go. But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw the commotion of people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he entered, he said to them, "Why are you making commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but is sleeping." And they laughed at him. Just a note that there are 12 disciples, certainly, but there's clearly like an inner circle. His executive team, if you will, is Peter, James, and John. There's kind of the four of them are often together when he needs to have a smaller team around him. So it's weird. The mourners there are actually professional mourners. So it's just something that was expected. It sounds very strange to us, but again, this is a different time. So I guess an analogy would be like if you went to a baseball game and there wasn't a seventh inning stretch. It's got nothing to do with anything, but it would be conspicuous if there wasn't a seventh inning stretch. So same way, it was just expected that you would have professional mourners. It's just kind of what they did. But he put them, meaning all the mourners and all the crowd, outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, as in Peter, James, and John, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. So a lot of us probably don't care, but this is in Aramaic, Talitha Kumai. A lot of scholars debate as to whether Jesus spoke in Aramaic and not Hebrew. We do know that from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were around the time of Jesus, that Hebrew was still very much in use of the day. And Acts 21 says that Paul spoke in Hebrew. Most of us probably don't care, but it is an interesting point of discussion. We know he didn't speak in Greek, that's for sure. It would have been either Hebrew or Aramaic. But unfortunately, kind of why I bring that up is, as is somewhat typical in church history, the fact that these quotes are in Aramaic and not Hebrew have led some to use this as proof that Jesus rejected the Jews and Hebrew, which is the Jewish language, because he knew they would reject him, right? So this would be totally laughable considering the context if the consequences for both Jews and the church weren't so dire, right? Yeah, just horrible things were done in the name of Jesus against the Jewish people. So I just point that up. The fact that this is in Aramaic means nothing about rejecting Israel or rejecting the Jews. Lancaster says that, kind of in contrast to this, the healing of the 12 women, of the woman who bled for 12 years, and the resurrection of the 12-year-old girl anticipates the restoration of the 12 tribes of Israel. So there's a connection with 12 meaning the number of Israel kind of thing. We know that Jesus was 12 when he went to the temple, so there's some sort of thing going on here with the number 12. The girl was now becoming a woman and would likely soon be married, according to Keener in his commentary. So a woman dying before marriage was seen as a particularly great tragedy. So Jesus saved her from that. And I see a connection because we individually and corporately are the bride of Christ. And Jesus is making sure that this young woman saw her wedding day, and he's going to bring us to our wedding day with our groom as well. So Jesus, of course, is the great healer. It's kind of turning into a running theme in our study, at least in this part of it. And with the application is that each of the persons Jesus interacts with represents us to some extent. So most of us were unclean Gentiles who had various spiritual impurities that that we come under the cover of his wings for healing. We were spiritually dead and have been raised to a new life. So all of these things here in these stories, if we place us as a picture of the people that he's healing and he's helping and raising from the dead, that is us. So one day we will also physically die, but we don't need to fear this because we all have the promise, just as with the 12-year-old girl, that Jesus will resurrect us. So that is it for this lesson. Next time we will be in, I believe, end of Matthew 9 and mostly Matthew 10, where we'll talk about one of the longer discourses in Matthew after the Sermon on the Mount. Is called the Apostles' Discourse. So pray that God keeps us and keeps us whole and close to him, sticking to him, and always in his word. And we will see you on the next video.